Good afternoon, everybody. I don't know how postprandial you all are. So yeah, I was supposed to come. I was actually looking at my slides the other day, and I saw January the 23rd. I'm thinking, what happened on January the 23rd? And I guess I was deliberately trying to suppress that memory. Yeah, okay, fine. So hopefully we won't have that for a while. Okay. So I'm going to start by telling you a story that goes back to a different January. This is January of 2012. So at that time, it was brought to our attention that a paper had been published in the British Medical Journal. The paper was written by a group of researchers at Yale, as well as Deborah Zarin, who's at the National Library of Medicine. And what they did was they looked at a series of NIH-funded clinical trials that had been registered in clinicaltrials.gov and that had been completed. There were about 600 some trials. And they wanted to see how long it took until the paper describing the main results of those trials came out. So this is shown on the graph on the right. So the x-axis is the time since the study was finished. So 0 would mean that the study is completed, follow-up is done, data set is locked. You could theoretically publish the results the very next day. Here's 20 months, 40 months, 60 months. And then the y-axis shows the percentage of studies in which a main result had been published. So they focused on 30 months. 30 months is 2.5 years after completion. And at 30 months, only about 45% or so of these trials had been completed. So the headline was that more than half of NIH-funded trials don't have their main results published either at all or in a timely way. So they were quite concerned about this because some years before, the FDA Amendments Act had been passed. The whole purpose of the FDA, or one of the functions of the FDA Amendment Act, was to deal with the problem of non-reporting of clinical trials. So the authors here point out that many NIH clinical trials, in fact, most NIH clinical trials, are not covered by the FDA Amendments Act. And these include trials of behavioral interventions, also trials of surgical procedures. They then said that no policies exist to make sure that the public has access to the results from NIH-funded research that is not published. Essentially, the public pays for the research gets done, and if the investigators don't publish the results, nobody will ever know. So this created quite a stir. There were reports on the radio and headlines in the newspaper. There were letters from Congress. There were a lot of messages coming into my inbox. I got phone calls from some of my former colleagues at Cleveland Clinic who they were wondering like what I actually did for a living, and they said, well, obviously you're not doing much. So our initial reaction to this was that it was wrong. We knew that everything was working just fine, that our trials, not only were our trials publishing their main results, but they were publishing their main results with great fanfare in the big journals, and they were getting into the newspapers. And so we figured there had to be some methodological error with how they did this. And so I was at NHLBI, I was a division director. I walked down the hall to my colleague, David Gordon. I said, I have a little assignment for you. I think this will take you about 3 days. And what I need you to do is I need you to look at all of our cardiovascular trials and tell me that all of them have had their results published and that they were all published quite quickly. Anyway, this project went on for about a year and a half, and in the time period of the study included a government shutdown, one that lasted, I think, 17 days. What we did was we looked at 244 consecutive trials that had been funded by NHLBI and that focused on cardiovascular medicine, and that had been completed over a period of about 10 years. So all these trials were completed, and we looked to see, same thing, how long it took until their main results were published. But we didn't rely on databases. We did this using brute force. So if we couldn't find the publication, we would contact the investigator and say, where's the publication? And this way we went through each one by one. So we came up with some findings, and we did publish those findings. We published those findings in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 2013. One of the things that we did when we did that study was we decided prospectively to divide our trials into two types: those that focus on clinical endpoints like death or heart attack or stroke, and those that focus on other kinds of endpoints, surrogate endpoints, because we wanted to see whether or not there was a difference. And I'll show you the results. So this, David Gordon was the lead author on this. He's the person who did a lot of the work, but we had a terrific team of people who worked on this. The plot here is very similar to what we had before. The x-axis is the number of months after the trial was completed, and the y-axis is the percentage of trials that were published, main results published by that time. So here are the trials that focus on clinical endpoints. So trials like the Women's Health Initiative trial would be an example. We found that after about a year, about 70% of these trials were published, and after about 2 years, every single one of them was published. And so we thought, that's great. That's exactly, everything is working just fine. But the problem is that those trials represented a distinct minority of the trials that we fund. Over 80% of the trials that we fund don't focus on clinical endpoints as their primary endpoint. They focus on surrogate endpoints. So like changes in cholesterol level or changes on a calcium scan. So these were most of the trials. And here we had a very different kind of picture. So at a year, about 10% of the trials had been published. And at 2 years, it was maybe about 40%. So since these trials represent the vast majority of the trials that we fund, in our effort to refute the results of the Yale study, we replicated them. So we then wrote a discussion, and in this discussion we said that there were a number of parties that share responsibility, and this includes funders, investigators, academic medical centers, clinical research organizations, and of course journals. And so I highlight funders because that's obviously who we are. Okay, so this comes out in 2013. I have to tell you, at the time, I thought that we had discovered something new. It turns out it was nothing new. Lots of people have observed this for quite a long time. In 2016, the group from Yale came out with another study. So they looked at a different cohort of about 4,000 trials that were completed between 2007 and 2010. And these were trials that were based at what they considered to be the major academic health centers in the United States. And that largely coincides with the top places that receive funding from the NIH. And they looked to see what proportion of the trials that were based in those places had their main results reported out in one way or another, either being posted on clinicaltrials.gov or being reported in a journal. And they decided to look at 2 years. Okay, so here's the result. This they published, by the way, in BMJ in 2016. So the x-axis here, these are names of institutions or academic health centers, and this is the percentage where the main result had been reported out one way or another within 2 years. So the winner, all the way here on the left, is the University of Minnesota. And the University of Minnesota had 55% of their trials posted within 2 years. Now, most of the places, and these are pretty famous places, were running about 35 to 40%. I remember when this paper came out, Francis said, "Oh, I have an assignment for you. Could you look up each of these places and tell me, how much money are we giving them, and then give me a table showing what it says." Okay, so the authors here say that despite the ethical mandate and expressed values of academic institutions, there is poor performance and noticeable variation in the dissemination of clinical trial results. When they did this study, what they thought they were going to find was that there were some places where the reporting rates were 90% or better. And then what they were going to do was they were going to go interview them and say, "Oh, so what are you doing?" So it would be a mixed methods type of study. But when they saw that even the very best wasn't doing very well, they had to change their plans. So the lead author on this was Harlan Krumholtz, who is he's a cardiologist, a professor at Yale. So he posted, at the same time that this paper came out, he posted a column on the NPR website in which he said what he really thought. Okay, so here's what he really thought. He said, academic medical centers get an F in sharing research results. He says here, we have a bottleneck at our nation's bastions of research excellence. Too many times the results are not reported, either in clinicaltrials.gov or in a medical journal. And this is so pervasive that it seems inappropriate to blame individuals. It's a systemic problem. And that's a really critical point here. The finger pointing doesn't really help. This is clearly a systems issue. And then he goes on to talk about why this is bad. Not reporting results violates a basic principle of the scientific method, which is when you do a scientific study, you should report out the results. It hurts patients, society, and science. It dishonors the people who gave their consent and bore the risk of participating. The holding back of results impedes progress towards scientific breakthroughs, corrupts the medical literature, and wastes research funding. So from our very parochial point of view, we're wasting money. Those studies that did not publish their results either at all or in a timely way, that's money that could have been spent to support another researcher who wished they had gotten had their grant funded. All right, so that's problem number one. Problem number one is that a large number of our studies, clinical trials, get funded, get completed, and yet the main results are not reported out either at all or in a timely way. Here's another problem. So this comes from the Government Accountability Office, or we affectionately know it as the GAO. Usually when you get a phone call from the GAO, you're not like jumping to pick up the phone and say, oh, what kind of day are you having? So they did this report. They actually did a whole series of reports on our stewardship of clinical trials. And this was one that came out in, I think it was early 2016, where they said, as an agency, you're not really doing a very good job of keeping track of what's going on. You can't even answer a simple question like, how many trials is NIH funding that is currently actively enrolling subjects? Can't answer that question. Now, we can estimate it, but we can't say today, Tuesday, May the 15th, we have X number of trials. And the reason is that we have, within the individual institutes, many of the institutes are running their trials exceedingly well, but there's no trans-NIH coordination, there's no and on a very simple level, we're not collecting the data that we need in order to be able to function as an effective steward across institutes. How do we know, for example, that a trial that's being funded in one institute is not very, very similar to a trial that's being funded in another institute, so much so that maybe it's not so smart to be funding both trials at the same time. So they say here, we need to identify data that we're going to collect and have a process for being more effective stewards. And the fact that we're not collecting this data means that we're limited in our ability to function as effective stewards. So one problem is we don't know what's coming out because the trials aren't being reported out. And then another problem that GAO says is that agency-wide, we don't know what's going in. So a lot of people have been working on this for a long time. I actually came into this rather late. I mean, we did our study at NHLBI, but that was one study that was done at one institute. But the trans-NIH efforts started around that time, and I didn't really get involved with those until late 2015. Hundreds of people across many institutes worked on this. And so this goes back, some of the more public effort starts around 2014 when the agency put out a proposed rule. The proposed rule or proposed policy, and the proposed policy would say, if NIH is funding a clinical trial, the trial needs to be registered. It needs to be registered within 21 days of when the first subject is enrolled. And it needs to be reported. And the results need to be reported on clinicaltrials.gov within a year of completion. So my predecessor, Sally Rocky, posted a blog. Kathy Hudson and Francis Collins posted a piece at JAMA in which they talked about reporting the results of clinical trials, and they bemoaned the fact that many clinical trials that we were funding did not have their results reported out. There was a request for comments. And we had this out for comment from November of 2014 through March of 2015, so for a fairly long time. Got a very robust response. We received comments, over 240 comments. These came from individuals, from institutions, as well as from professional societies that together represented well over 100,000 scientists. And so this then eventually led to a policy being posted in the Federal Register in September of 2016. This is quite a long document. In there, it says here that a fundamental principle or premise of all NIH-funded research is that the results must be disseminated. And this is particularly important if we're doing prospective experiments on people. If we're doing prospective experiments on people, there's an additional ethical dimension to this. And they say here that scientists have an ethical obligation to ensure that the burden and risk that volunteers assume comes to something. At the very least, by ensuring that others are aware of the study and that its findings contribute to the body of scientific knowledge. So ensuring that others are aware of the study means registration, and that the findings contribute to the body of general scientific knowledge means that the results are reported. And there was a lot of publicity that happened when this was announced in September of 2016. This included Kathy Hudson, Francis Collins, and I posted another piece in JAMA in which we describe what was going on. Carrie Wallenetz, who is was and is the head of a science policy within the office of the director, played a major role in leading this, and we posted a joint blog. There was also a copy of the Federal Register notice was posted in the NIH guide. Now, when we got those comments, those 240 comments, some folks said, well, it's a good idea, but it really shouldn't apply to certain types of studies. Like, for example, it shouldn't apply to exploratory trials or small trials or trials or safety trials or trials that don't meet their enrollment targets. This was something that the folks who wrote the policy addressed. And they said here, we disagree with commenters who suggest that there is no need for the coverage of these trials. The benefits of transparency and the need to fulfill the ethical obligation to participants is as relevant to these types of trials as to any other type. Another complaint was that 12 months was too short a period of time. Here the policy addresses that, and they say they think 12 months is enough time to balance the interests of enabling the investigators to get their work done and put together a decent analysis that they can be proud of, but also meeting the interests of the public in having access to the results of a publicly funded trial. And fundamentally what we're talking about here is the public is paying money for scientists to conduct experiments on people. The public has a right to know what the results showed. So this is a systems issue, and so there's a lot of stuff going on. If you think about the life cycle of a trial, we start with the idea. It gets an application comes in. It gets reviewed. Hopefully, it gets funded. It gets IRB review. It may or may not get FDA. FDA only applies to a minority of the trials that we do here at NIH. Hopefully, the study gets done and the results come out. So in order for the results to come out, we need the results to be reported. In order to know that we should be expecting a report on a trial, we need to know that the trial exists. In order to know that the trial exists, the trial itself has to be registered. And now we need to know whether or not to expect a registration. So in order to know whether or not to expect a registration, the grant package has to somehow indicate that this is, in fact, a trial, and therefore we're expecting a registration to come in. So this way we try to address both issues. We try to address the issue of results being reported out and being reported out in a timely way. And the other is addressing the GAO with their very strong recommendations that we do a better job of keeping track of the trials that we are funding and collecting at least the minimal amount of data so that we can function as more effective stewards. So we've put out a lot of resources on this. We've given talks in many settings. I'm giving this talk right now. But we've been in a number of places. This is our website where we have a lot of information here. There are decision tools, there are videos, there are demos, there are references to various documents. We also have a lot here. Here's the little padlock. That's for NIH staff. A lot of resources for NIH staff as well. And this includes, for example, information about the details of registering and reporting the results. Eventually, we're going to get to a point where we have to have some teeth in this policy. And so as part of that, this is what Francis, Kathy, and I wrote, which is that we will reserve the right to withhold funding for future trials from an institution that does not register and report the results of the trials that it does, trials that we are funding. Our hope is that we'll never have to do this. By virtue of the fact that the senior administration at institutions know that their funding in part depends on this, they will create the cultures within their institutions so that the results do get reported out in a timely way. So I'm going to end with two news headlines. One headline is one that we created ourselves. So this is an NIH press release, and it says here, HHS and NIH take steps to enhance the transparency of clinical trial results. And then here's another headline, and this is in Vox. This headline says, a surprising amount of medical research isn't made public. That's dangerous. Okay, so what's interesting about the two headlines? What's interesting about the two headlines is what you probably can't see because of the size of the font, and that's the dates that these headlines came out. So this one came out on November 19, 2014. That's not quite 4 years ago. This one came out on August the 1st, 2017. That was a few months ago. So as you can see, we're making great progress. Now, to be fair, when this article came out, they did say NIH is doing something about this, and that NIH is rolling out a series of policies to assure that the trials that it funds will lead to timely reporting, and they actually had links to our policies. What they also said is that the policies are only just now being implemented, and whether or not they're going to actually work and turn this curve, we don't know. But I do think that it is interesting that more and more people are clearly interested in this problem, and they have an expectation that when public monies are being spent, especially scarce public monies, and especially when we're dealing with the kind of super competition, hyper competition we're dealing with at NIH, that we should assure them that if we're paying scientists to conduct experiments on people, that the results of those experiments will be known, and will be known in a timely way, and in that way we'll do our part to enhance the benefits and the quality of our scientific enterprise, and ultimately the health of all of us. So thanks.